Hey there everyone, welcome to Tabletop Toolbox. I'm your host, Jeff, and today I'm bringing you a special episode where I'm going to recap my experiences at the 2024 Dice Tower East Convention, which took place last week in Orlando, Florida over the 4th of July holiday weekend. Why they picked the 4th of July holiday to have the convention, I have no idea, but it was a good experience nonetheless, and I'm going to tell you about some of my experiences there, mainly the games that I played, but also some of the events that I attended. So with all that being said, let's kick it off. Now this was my first time attending Dice Tower East, so I got in actually about 3 a.m. on Tuesday morning, thanks to some phenomenal flight planning from American Airlines. However, I got a little bit of sleep, and then I was helping with some setup for the event, and also helping to register attendees as they were starting to get into town. But in that evening, I saw one attendee by the name of Mark. He was setting up a game of Radlands on a table in one of the open gaming rooms, and I thought I would sit down and join him. So he taught me how to play. We started to get into the game a little bit, and then he revealed that he had recently competed in a world championship of Radlands and came in 4th place. Thank you so much, Mark, for letting me know that ahead of time. So he completely cleaned the table with me, had no problem taking me out of the game, but I still really enjoyed the experience. Radlands is a card-based game. There is a mat that you can get that kind of helps organize all the components, but you're basically playing cards. These can be either events or just various sort of thugs. This is almost kind of set in a Mad Max type, universe. You have these 3 bases that you get at the beginning of the game, and you're defending them from attack. So you're playing these personnel and these events, and even some unique cards that you can play, trying to simply attack the other player. It's a 2-player only type game. And yeah, that's basically what it is. Each of these cards have different abilities. They have unique costs. You're paying for everything using water for the most part. And so it's a matter of trying to keep your bases defended, being able to deal damage with the cards that you have. When cards get damaged, you then can't trigger most of their effects. And so it's just a lot of resource and card manipulation, trying to keep your tableau established long enough to be able to take out your opponent's bases before they take yours out, which I was not able to do, but I still had a lot of fun with this one. I like those kinds of games where it's about building synergy between the various cards. I thought that I had some pretty useful cards. I had one that actually acted as this kind of massive tank, that my base itself was a tank that would move towards the opponent's side of the table and then wipe out one of their bases. Of course, Mark managed to take it out before he could do that, but it was still kind of neat to see how these different cards interacted. I certainly realized a couple of things that I didn't do correctly as the game started off, but I was playing against a 4th place world champion, so what was I going to do? I still had a lot of fun with this one though. That was Radlands. And then came Wednesday. Wednesday was the first full day of the convention. That was the first day that the main ballroom was open for gaming, and the Dice Tower library, containing over 2,000 different games, was available for people to check out games and play in that open room. I am quite familiar with the Dice Tower library. It's always been in use at the Dice Tower retreat events that I've attended for the past 3 years, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. However, I was trying to look for some stuff that I had not had a chance to play yet, and the first game I picked off the shelf was Wyrmspan by Stonemaier Games. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Wingspan. I think it's an okay game, but I've never really liked that sort of Go Fish aspect where you're trying to find cards that work with the engine that you're already building, that works with the cards you already have in place that require additional cards for scoring. I've just always kind of been frustrated by the randomness of trying to get cards out of the deck of Wingspan. Wyrmspan, I felt, dealt with a lot of those issues fairly well. However, before I got to play with it, I sat down with my flags. Dice Tower East uses these green and yellow flags. Green means that you're looking for players, and yellow means that you're looking for a teach. So I sat down with those 2 flags and immediately was kind of hollered at by the table next to me, who said, well, hey, look, we'll help you play that game if you'll help us out with this game first. And that game was the brand new Harmonies. Now, Harmonies is a very popular title right now. This is sort of a abstract tile laying tableau building game where you're trying to match various patterns on a small player board that then lets you place various animals, simply represented by cubes, into your tableau. And the arrangement of the tokens on your board, as well as the animals that you get placed onto your board, will all equate to points at the end of the game. The folks that I was playing with, a lady by the name of Missy and her son and his girlfriend, were just hilarious people to play with. I had a fantastic time meeting and playing with them. I got to teach them harmonies and then whoop their butts at it. Haha, take that. But this is a fantastic game. I was actually surprised by this one. This has received a ton of hype lately, and so I kind of went into Harmonies with a little bit of trepidation. I already have it, by the way. I picked it up just a few weeks ago and I've already gotten a couple of plays in, so I had no problem teaching them Harmonies and wiping the floor with them. However, after that, then taught me Wyrmspan, and as I mentioned, this is kind of a Wingspan adjacent. It's regarded by a lot of folks as an improvement over Wingspan, but it uses a lot of the same ideas and mechanisms. You have these 3 rows of cards on your player board. You have to excavate and explore into these 3 different caves. You're playing out these cave excavation cards, which will give you immediate effects when they are played. And then those spaces become available to place dragons in later on throughout the game. You're kind of inviting these dragons to come and live in this cave. And that is where you do start to run into some of those aspects of you need certain dragons to live in those certain caves. Those dragons may provide unique scoring opportunities based on the caves that they're in or the cards that they're adjacent to, so on and so forth. And so there was still a little bit of that, what I call the go fish aspect, where, okay, I really need a dragon that lives in this top row. But those are a little easier to come by than ones that are maybe looking for a very, very specific, type of dragon or a type of nest or something like that. So it was a little more forgiving, I felt, than Wingspan. There's also this secondary board. It's a guild board, and various things throughout the game will let you move around this board, and that provides a lot of extra things, extra resources, extra cards, extra dragons, kind of whatever you're looking for. It also provides opportunities for additional scoring just at the end of the game. And what I really thought was neat with this game is that, unlike Wingspan, where you have a set number of actions that you're taking each round and those actions dwindle throughout the game, Wyrmspan is more constant. You start off, I believe it's with 6 actions every turn, but then there are ways that you can pick up more of these actions. And if you chain those things together fairly well, you can just stack up action on top of action, and everyone else kind of passes, and you're able to just kind of keep working through the game's engine. And I really like that. In fact, I like this game so much that I went ahead and ordered my own copy. It should be in here in a few days. So that is my recap of Harmonies and Wyrmspan, my start to Wednesday at Dice Tower East. So after those 2 games and a quick lunch break, I got back to the Dice Tower library and I grabbed a copy of Everdell Farshore off the shelf. This is a spiritual successor, if you will, to the base game of Everdell, which I have the full collection of, right? I have that massive big box edition of Everdell. Farshore is supposed to streamline the Everdell experience, and it does that in 2 specific ways. First of all, it changes up the event cards from the base game, which would require 2 or more specific cards in your tableau before you could then claim and play one of these event cards, which simply gave you some in-game scoring. So for example, you may need to have the church and the pastor, or the church and the school, or something like that, in order to claim these events. With the Farshore edition, you simply have to have sets of cards of the different types. So maybe you have to have 4 of the production cards, or 2 of the traveler cards, and then you can claim these events, or these maps actually, but you do have to spend a worker to do so. And so that was one of those things where you're kind of racing your opponents to see if you can get these conditions met, but you often would find, as we did, that it was more valuable to go ahead and get the resources from your workers and trigger all the other in-game abilities, and then maybe see if you were able to pick off a couple of these maps at the end of the game when maybe you had some extra workers left. Maybe your tableau was already full of the 15 cards, and you're just kind of looking for some extra ways to grab points. There is also a change in the way that in base Everdell you could use cards to, usually construction cards, to then bring out a critter card for free. So maybe if you had the school, you could bring out the teacher, just as an example, with no additional cost. You didn't have to pay for the resources, you just had to sort of mark that you had used the card for that effect. But again, this required having those cards available to you, having them available either in the meadow display or in your hand. And if you couldn't find those cards, then you just kind of sat there with an unused building. In the Farshore edition, they've given you these anchor tokens, and you can simply trigger the construction card of one type to bring out a critter of the same type. So again, if the school building was maybe a green building or a blue building, I don't remember what the types are called, but you could simply place an anchor on it to bring out a green or a blue critter for free. Again, you didn't have to pay the resources, but you only got 3 of these anchors. You can only do it 3 times, but it was still a much more efficient idea. One element that Farshore adds over base Everdell is a boat track that runs around the bottom and sides of the main board, and each space on that track gives you points at the end of the game, but various spaces along that track will also give you treasure chests, which you can use throughout the game as a wild resource, or they will also give you points at the end of the game. And you moved along that track because of these 2 tokens that would sit out in each season, and they may reference a type of card, again, like the green cards, the blue cards, but they would also then provide a keyword, whether that was construction, critter, unique, or common, and there may have been one other one in there. And so if you played a green common construction card, and maybe green cards and commons were the 2 criteria for that season, that would let you move 2 spaces on that track. If you played a green critter, which would not match one of those criteria, then you'd only move 1 space. And I really did like that track. There were also some cards that came out, a couple of which that I got, which maybe gave you extra points for how many treasures you still had left at the end of the game, maybe extra points for how many treasure spaces you had passed on that track. And so there were some extra scoring opportunities based on that track, and I really enjoyed that. Overall, however, while I really did like Everdell Farshore, I don't really think that it did enough different from everything that's already out there for Everdell. If you are not much of an expansion collector and you haven't played base Everdell, maybe don't have it, then I would certainly recommend going ahead and jumping up to Farshore. However, for folks like me who have everything for base Everdell, I don't think that Farshore alone provides enough difference or enough improvement over the base experience to warrant getting it and playing it instead of base Everdell with all the expansions. Don't know if we're going to see more content for Everdell Farshore, but for now, I think that there's more overall for Everdell that warrants not necessarily adding Farshore to my collection. Anyways, that was that experience with Everdell Farshore. After Everdell Farshore, I got to join a table that had a green flag up. They were playing Caldera Park. Now, this is a Michael Kiesling and Wolfgang Kramer game from 2022, and it looks quite simplistic on the table. Basically, players have a board in front of them showing a variety of forest, plains, mountain, and I believe desert tiles. There's a volcano in the center. There's a river that kind of runs through all of these different features. There are some waterfalls along the way, and there are a couple spaces that show these kind of misty overlays over top of this overall hexagonal grid. Players then have a number of animal tokens, and each player has the same collection of those tokens. They also have a variety of weather tokens. One of them shows a sunny tile with a bunch of animals on it, and the other one shows a variety of different weather patterns, either thunderclouds or shows specific animals that cannot sit next to that tile by the end of the game. And throughout this game, you're simply trying to get these animal tiles out onto your board in any arrangement that you are able to, and you're trying to kind of build families of these animals by connecting them to each of the different hexagonal tiles. So for example, you may have these, you had bison that were in the game, and various tiles will show bison on it. Maybe 1 bison, 2 bison, 3 bison, but then they may also show a bison with other animals, and that kind of lets you intermingle these different families. You can have sort of bison heading in one direction and mountain goats heading in another. They can crisscross, and as long as you can play them efficiently onto your tableau, you can score these large families. They'll also have these watering holes shown on a couple different tiles, and so at the end of the game, you will score, first of all, based on how many of these different environments you've managed to completely cover or surround, etc. But then you're also going to score for each animal family. And so you're going to take the largest family of animals that you have built. Again, maybe the bison. You're going to look at how many bison tiles you have connected in your largest group, multiplied by the number of watering holes you have in that family. So if you have, say, 8 bison and 3 different watering holes, even if there are different animals visiting that watering hole on the tile, as long as one of them is a bison and it's part of that group, then it will count. And so you would have 24 points in that example. If you, of course, had a whole bunch of bison and no watering holes, well, then you have no points whatsoever for that animal. I thought this game was kind of cute. I thought it was neat. The way that you were placing these tiles out is that on each player's turn, they will simply pick a type of animal and a type of environment. So you may say, hey, I'm going to put a bear in the mountains, or I'm going to put a bison somewhere along the river. And players simply have to meet that criteria if they can. If you don't have any tiles currently in front of you that show that particular animal, then you can place any animal. And if you have already covered all of the terrain of that type on your board, then you can place that animal in any available tile on your map. And so, especially a little later in the game, you start to run into a little extra flexibility, which was actually kind of nice. It meant that, whereas most of these games give you dwindling options, I'm thinking of games like Calico, or even any of the Azul games, where you're sort of running out of options later in the game. This one actually became a little bit more freeing, a little more flexible as you got towards the end of the game. But I was also a little disappointed in the fact that as you're playing out all these animals and you're covering up these different terrains, the background of every animal tile is simply green. And so you go from this somewhat colorful, if not a little bit MS Paint looking player board, to one just covered with green tiles and animals. And so that was a little bit of a letdown, I thought, but still enjoyed the puzzle of this one, Caldera Park. Now, after that, I joined another table that was sitting down to play Pan Am. Pan Am is a game from Funko Games and is designed by Prospero Hall, which is no longer a part of Funko, which is a little bit of a disappointment for a lot of the gaming community. Pan Am is a game based on, I believe it's set back in the 1960s, maybe a little further back, when the airline company Pan Am was just kind of laying claim to the airline industry across the US, actually across the globe. And so what you're trying to do is establish these routes. You're trying to connect different cities, placing down airplanes that represent maybe the size of those routes. I was doing a lot of work over in Europe. I had some routes between Paris, even a couple going down into cities in Russia. And then what you're sort of hoping happens is that as Pan Am starts to expand from its headquarters, I believe in Miami, and as it spreads across these different routes, it will start to buy up the routes that you have established, paying you money for them. And that's how you succeed in the game. It's not about actually building the routes between the cities. It's about building routes that will then get bought up by Pan Am. As the one player who was teaching us the game, it's not about you, it's about Pan Am. And so what you want to do is, get yourself purchased out by Pan Am and make the most money. And then as you're making that money, you're buying shares of Pan Am. And at the end of the game, it's simply the player who has the most Pan Am shares that will win the game. This one was a little difficult. As we kind of understood the idea of it, it was a little too late to put those things in place. So as I started building out in the London area, I realized that I was actually at the end of a lot of these routes that Pan Am would expand along. And so in fact, very few of my routes ever got purchased. They only got purchased when a certain die value got rolled from the Pan Am die that you would roll a number of times in each round as determined by these random cards that you're flipping over. And so I definitely did not put myself into a good place at the beginning of the game, but of course I really didn't understand that at that point. Now the last card, the last sort of round card of the game that was played said that players would then get extra shares at the end of the game for each route that they still had, for each route that had not gotten purchased by Pan Am. And I was going to score a ton of stocks off of that, except we kind of forgot about it at the end of the game because I had to run off to an event for Dice Tower East as I was kind of helping out with the show. And so we actually forgot to score that. And I came in second place in the game, and I do wonder if that would have actually helped let me win the game. But that's okay. It was still a neat experience. Not a game I think I'm going to pick up. A lot of the folks that I know I don't think would have enjoyed that type of a game. But it was a neat puzzle, a neat experience, and I would certainly play things differently if I ever got a chance at Pan Am by Funko Games. That was the end of the day on Wednesday. On Thursday, I got down to the game room and I took Leaf off the shelf of the Dice Tower library, and I was joined by a very nice father and daughter team, Derek and Valerie from, I believe, Toronto, they said, joined me at the table to play Leaf. Leaf is a very colorful game. This is from Weird City Games. Designer is Tim Eisner, and you've got these colorful, I believe they were wooden leaf tokens that you're putting out, these sort of large leaf tiles, and they come in these different shapes and sizes and different colors specifically. And as you're playing out a leaf into this central display that all players are working in together, you are triggering various actions based on the other colors of the other leaves that your leaf touches. So if you touch, just one or two different leaves, you may only get a couple of actions, but if you can sort of get a larger leaf in there in a way that it touches a bunch of different leaves of different colors, you'll get to do a lot of different things on your turn. But those actions are fairly simplistic. There is a tree with a couple of different tracks on it that you're going up for just extra points or maybe extra actions. There's sort of a market or display of animal cards that you can collect, and at various points you'll be able to move those cards into hibernation, and you'll get points for the different sets of animals that you collect at the end of the game. And then you'll also be able to put mushrooms out onto various leaves. If a player touches a leaf or connects to a leaf that has one of your mushrooms on it, you'll be able to take some extra points. And then also at the end of the game, you'll get some extra points based on the sort of largest group of mushrooms that you have in this display. A very cute game, a simple game, fairly light. Valerie grabbed this one quickly. She grasped this one quite quickly and blew her dad and I out of the water. A very pretty game, not something I'm looking to pick up though. Leaf by Weird City Games. And then they ran up to the library and they brought back a copy of Things in Rings. This is a brand new game from Allplay, and it is sort of a party social deduction style game, which is not one that I tend to gravitate towards. However, I thought this one was pretty cute. You have these, I believe there's only 3, and you can play with less than 3 sort of strings, and you arrange them into a circle as best you can, basically a Venn diagram. So you're building it so that each ring will overlap with the ring next to it, but then all 3 rings overlap in the center. One player then becomes sort of the judge. They may have an official title. I was never told what it was. And you'll be playing cards into these circles. The judge will then review that card. They have sort of a secret key, and they know what each of the rings represents. And so they will then determine if you put that card in the right ring based on criteria that only they know. And these cards are very basic items. So I think we had a pet, maybe a snake. We had crayons, we had paper, we had a yacht, we had a car, a truck, that kind of stuff. And those rings may have criteria like would hurt if they fall on you. Criteria like would belong in a school. And I can't remember the third one was the words are exactly 5 letters. And so as we were playing these cards, Valerie would pick them up and move them into the appropriate spot in this Venn diagram, either specifically in one circle, in any of the gaps between the 2 circles, or that central space. And then we had to kind of figure out what the criteria of those circles were. If we placed it in the wrong spot and she moved it, we had to draw another card. If we played it correctly, then we didn't draw a card and we got to immediately go again. And so the first player to run out of cards would win the game. And Derek did. Her father won this one. And I had a lot of fun with this one, actually. I thought this was pretty neat. Again, that deduction thing is not really my favorite mechanism of play. And I also don't really see myself in groups of people where I think this game would do well. But I think it was a very good game. So if you find yourself as more of a party gamer, again, it's not the social deduction in the whodunit, who's the bad guy kind of thing, and I enjoyed that. I did figure out, for example, the 5 letters that was the only one that I figured out. The how much something or could hurt you if it fell on you completely escaped me. And I could see that being a hard one to get, right? However, I really did enjoy this game, and I think that if you find yourself in that kind of environment where you're playing games like this, I think you would have a lot of fun with Things in Rings by Allplay. After those 2 games and some lunch, I sat down with some good friends that I've known from the Dice Tower Retreat to play Let's Go to Japan. Now, this is by AEG, and it's a game that I've played many times before, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one, but basically you're trying to plan out various events across a 6-day trip to Japan, and then you sort of run through those 6 days, scoring a multitude of different things, and ultimately trying to get the most points by having the most successful trip to Japan. I like this game. My daughter absolutely loves this game. My only complaint at this point is that I've kind of seen everything that this game has to offer. There's in fact a lot of duplicate cards throughout this game, and there are some certain things that you really have to do if you want to have a good score. For example, there is a negative stress and positive stress track. They score independently of each other. The positive stress can give you up to a maximum of 20 points. I think the negative one can give you a maximum of negative 15 points, if I recall. And you, of course, want to peg the 20 and not move up the negative point track. And if you can do that, that's an easy 20 points, which is often more points than you'll get from any one single day of events throughout your trip. The other thing that I'm kind of a little annoyed about with this game is that it plays very well at 2 or 3 players. You're supposed to do the trip to Japan simultaneous, but you only kind of get one score sheet for all the players, and so you've got to kind of either you play the trip simultaneously and you're kind of just shouting out your scores so someone can be writing them down, or maybe you've got to just use a whole bunch of different score sheets. We like to play it independently, where each player, one at a time sort of takes their trip. And then you kind of feel like you're actually telling a story. Okay, on Monday I went to these places and I did these things and I move up these tracks. And on Tuesday I did these things. And that's a lot of fun. And my daughter especially loves doing that. But if you're doing that 5-player, it will add a ton of time onto the game. So the simultaneous doesn't really quite work, and it's also not quite as fun, but the sequential takes a lot longer, and so I don't know, it's like neither system really works very well. I do like the game, and luckily AEG is fairly known for doing expansions, so I hope to see more out of Let's Go to Japan. By that point in the convention, the expo hall had opened. Now, it was a fairly small expo hall. There were a number of vendors there. Arcane Wonders, Allplay, Dan Halligan was there with Obsession. There were a couple other small publishers there, a couple places selling dice and gaming accessories, even some snacks. And then in the one corner was Devere. Devere had a couple of tables just outside the expo hall where you could demo some of their games. They had Sand, Salton Sea, and Cities. And I sat down to play a game of Cities. This is a city building game where players are trying to complete a 3x3 grid of these 2x2 tiles, and you're basically throughout the game you're putting various features onto your city. You could have these sort of set collection tokens that you were playing onto park or water spaces. You had these plastic city buildings that you could stack up, and of course the tiles themselves were unique, and you were sort of drafting these throughout the game. And there was also these unique bonuses that each player could work towards on their own, and also some common space, some common criteria that you were working towards based on which city you were allegedly building in. And we were playing the basic New York, city. The game was colorful by the time it was over, and it certainly kind of looked nice. It was nice to kind of build out your little city in front of you, but I did not feel that Cities did anything unique whatsoever. The only thing that was kind of interesting in the game was that you've got this main board with these scoring cards, these criteria cards, the plastic city buildings, the 2x2 city grids, and these multicolored feature tiles, and you could only take one of each thing in each round of the game. You played 8 rounds, ultimately ending with this 3x3 grid. And so throughout the game, you were kind of going, okay, well, I definitely need to get to that before someone else does, but I also really kind of need this. And so it kind of had that risk versus reward inner turmoil of trying to get to things before someone else got to them. And that was kind of neat, although, again, not necessarily unique. And by the end of it, it was, just a race to get points for all the different things that happened. And it really just kind of came down to, did the things come out that you needed? Were you able to get them in the order that you needed? And could you get, enough points by the end of the game? It just wasn't unique. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't creative. And I was kind of like, okay, yeah, hey, I played this game, and I think I actually won that game, but I have no interest in ever going back to visit Cities by Devere. The last game I got to play on Thursday was Forest Shuffle. This is by Lookout Games, and I joined Missy and her family and friends from the Harmonies and Wyrmspan group that I played with on Wednesday. Forest Shuffle uses a large deck of cards, and you're simply building out this tableau of a forest. You have to start off with these tree cards, and each tree may have its own scoring criteria, and then you can tuck an animal card on each side of it, and then usually like a bird or some sort of a maybe fauna, other type of small animals or other maybe shrubs, something like that underneath the tree. So around each tree you can have 4 different cards, one on each side, one on the top, one on the bottom. And each of these cards just have a ton of different scoring criteria. This is point salad kind of personified. And you're drawing these cards either from the deck or as cards get discarded to pay to play other cards, you can then take the cards from the central display. But if at any point there were 10 or more cards in that central display, then the whole pack of them get all gathered up and discarded and are out of the game. And again, it's one of those just kind of a crapshoot game, right? You're just hoovering up cards, trying to play cards. Sometimes you'll be grabbing cards just so you can turn around and use them as a resource to pay for other cards that you want to play. And it just comes down to how quickly you can get the things that you need to get. Missy, who taught and played the game with us, had never played it at 5, and so she was just overwhelmed by how quickly the game progressed and how quickly it wrapped up. Having never played it before, it just kind of felt like a big crapshoot to me. I could also see this being an AP nightmare for players because each card has unique scoring criteria. Some of them have, maybe they require having a bunch of that same kind of card. Maybe they require being around cards that have certain symbols on it. There's so much that you need to read and absorb and consider. And for some of the people that I play with, I could see themselves just staring at their hand of cards and trying to figure out their best path forward, and just their mind kind of locking up with all the different paths that you could take in this game. So I thought it was pretty, and I kind of ultimately liked the way that it worked, but definitely not a game for me or my game group. Forest Shuffle by Lookout Games. That was the last game I played on Thursday before I went to see Joey Evans, who is also with the Dice Tower, and he did a magical comedy show, which was quite entertaining, actually. I really enjoyed getting to see that. He did a particular trick where he was playing cards from a deck along with music, and one of the key moments was that he played 8, 6, 7, 5, 3, 9 to the chorus of Jenny from the, I believe, the 70s or 80s. And he did that 4 times, just quickly playing through these cards. Did a couple other, card plays along to certain themes of music. 1999, I believe, was one of them. But he did it while he was also shuffling the cards. And so it was a really pretty neat trick. I was pretty impressed with that. On Friday, the first game I played when I got down to the library was Amalfi Renaissance. Now, this is by R&R Games, and I had seen this before at, I believe it was PAX Unplugged, maybe it was even Gen Con. I think they had it on sort of a demo table at Gen Con. A lady kind of walked me through how the game worked, and I was immediately just turned off from it when she made the comment that as you build more lighthouses, you have more places to store bread. I didn't think that made any sense, so I thanked her for her time and I left the table. However, it is a really pretty looking game, and so when I saw it there on the shelf of the library, I thought, I really want to try this out. I was joined by a couple other, some folks that I had met and some new folks there at the con, and so we sat down and we played this. In fact, one gentleman was nice enough to sit down and teach it with me when he saw my yellow flag. And it was actually a pretty neat game. It again uses a concept where, so first of all, it's worker placement, and you're playing these boats as your workers. And so you may put a boat out on the main board that then allows you to move boats to a spot on your player board. And then later on, you're pulling those boats back from your own player board to generate resources. So for example, if you wanted to build more boats to have more workers, each boat had a decreasing cost in wood. And so if you had sent boats off to collect wood, you could pull those boats back to generate 3 wood each, for an example. And if you needed 4 wood to build the next boat, well, you had a surplus of 2, and so those 2 got stored as bread. stay with me. And if you needed 8 wood and you only generated 6, well, then at that moment you could actually send a boat permanently back to like the port or whatever it was called. I can't remember what it was called, but it was another space on your board that kind of locked that boat for the rest of that round, but gave you an extra 3 wild resources. So in that case, you would have generated 6 from coming back with the wood and an extra 3 by sort of sacrificing the boat to the port. So now you had 9, you only needed 8. And so again, you got to store the excess as bread. You had these cards in your hand that you had gotten from the beginning of the game, and we played a basic mode where you kind of started off with a common set of cards that were kind of based on a single theme. My theme was generating spice, which was a harder resource to get, but it gave me a couple discounts using that spice. And you were playing those cards by either using other resources, maybe using your bread. There was a variety of different things that would let you play these cards. Some of these cards gave you a one-time ability. Some of them gave you an ongoing ability. Some of them gave you an ability that you could kind of tap that card to trigger. A lot of stuff going on in this game. It was fairly heavy. It was a little difficult to kind of get the idea of. And one of the gentlemen that I was playing with, man, it just clicked with him. He had a pretty unique set of cards he was able to kind of put into play very quickly, and he clobbered us in this game. I did enjoy the puzzle of it. If I remember, I came in 3rd place by 1 point over the gentleman who taught us the game, which I thought was kind of interesting. But I did like the puzzle of it. Again, one of those games that it took me a little too long to kind of figure out what I should have been doing. Not a game that I think I'm going to rush out to grab, and add to my collection at any point, but I did enjoy the puzzle of Amalfi Renaissance. After Amalfi took something like 3 hours to play and I got some lunch, I returned to the expo hall where they actually had set up a demo of a game called Path of Civilization. And I already seen this game a couple times in the gaming area setup, and I'm usually fond of civilization-themed games, and so I kind of waited around for a chance to play this. I also managed to grab my friends Derek and Valerie, the father and daughter team I had played with earlier in the week, and they sat down to play this game with me, and we were taught by sort of one of the developing team. Her name was Ava, and she taught us how to play this game. Path of Civilization is a fairly abstract game. It has about 9 rounds of play, and each round there are certain criteria that you're trying to aim for to score some points at the end of that round. And there's a lot going on. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but you're acquiring these technology cards. At the beginning of each round, you pick 4 of these cards to put on your player board. 1 gets permanently lost to the discard pile. The cards on the left will generate sort of actions for you later on in the round. The cards on the right will give you resources that you can use to acquire more technology cards. And you're trying to get leaders in place. You're trying to sort of prepare yourself for battles and such. Like I said, a lot of things going on. But what's really neat is that through the 6 or so phases of each round of the game, you're playing a lot of simultaneous stuff. And so when you're trying to get leaders, there's going to be a market of cards available, and you're just sort of picking which ones you want to get. And if 2 people are trying to get the same thing, then your player board sort of helps dictate who has priority over that card based on the color or suit, if you will, of that card. And then, like I said, at the end of each round, you're either trying to sort of show off various accomplishments or you're going on a battle. And the nice thing that I really liked about this game is that the combat doesn't hurt anybody. It's basically just trying to see who has the most combat ability. There is a neutral character that becomes more and more powerful throughout the game, but nobody loses anything. So I actually won all of the combat rounds of the game, but I never took anything from anybody. I didn't really hurt anybody. I did lose the game actually to Derek at the end by just a handful of points, but I really enjoyed the puzzle of this one, and I did go ahead and pick up a copy. The biggest complaint that people have had about this game is that the presentation is not stellar. It doesn't look amazing, and it certainly is not helped by the fact that it uses, I understand, all AI-generated art, and that's definitely going to turn some folks off, which is a bit unfortunate because, like I said, it's a pretty decent game, and a lot of folks have enjoyed the puzzle of this one. I also like the fact that it can play fairly quickly thanks to simultaneous play, and so I am looking forward to checking out a bit more of Path of Civilization. After the demo of Path of Civilization, I went and sat down to a demo of Salton Sea, again by DeVere. We didn't play the game at that moment, but I did kind of get a walkthrough of how it plays. I then managed to get over to the library, pluck a copy off the shelves, and sat down with some friends, including Mark, who had clobbered me at Radlands, and we tried to sit down and play this game. Now, I'm going to tell you that Salton Sea is a fairly complex game. The idea is that you are trying to harvest lithium in Salton Sea, which is actually out in California, where they're doing a lot of excavation to try and get lithium for rechargeable batteries, which of course is now very, very popular because of electric vehicles. You're trying to drill down into the earth, you're trying to collect the brine. You can then process the brine into either thermal energy or lithium, which you can use to complete contracts or simply sell off the energy or the lithium for money. What was kind of interesting is that you could sell off those components for simply money, or you can complete contracts for money and points, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. The real clutch of this game, while it is a worker placement game, it also uses as its currency cards, which also act as actions. So if you get a $3 card, it may give you a fairly powerful action. You can take that action with one of your workers, but then you can't use that card as money until the end of the round when you've collected up all your workers, sort of freeing up your money to be used again. And this was neat at first. I thought this was a neat idea, but what I quickly found was that, okay, well, I could take this action, because obviously those are more powerful actions than the ones that simply come on your player board, but then it locks up your money. But you need that money to process the brine into those other resources. And so what you quickly find yourself doing was saying, well, I'm going to go ahead and take these actions and sort of set myself up. And then on my next turn, I'm going to use that money to start processing the brine that I have and using that to generate more money and points. And then you got to the next round of, oh, geez, well, hey, that technology is out. And gosh, I'd really like to get that technology. But again, I need to use that money to be able to use the action to get that technology, which I can do cheaper than if I'm doing it for my player board. Okay, so I'll wait until the next round and then I'll trigger off all that stuff. And so you spend your money in other ways. You use your actions instead of using the money. And it just kind of keeps snowballing. The guy who taught us, who provided the demo of the game, said, well, yeah, you're always going to be broke in this game. But that's because you're using your money as actions as opposed to just using your money as money. And I thought it was a neat idea, certainly a unique idea, but you almost kind of found yourself stuck in this death loop of, I'm just going to wait to use my money. I'm going to wait some more. I'm going to wait a little bit longer. And maybe that's the idea, but it made the game really, really long. We played this thing for an hour and a half, and we were nowhere near any of the end game triggers because, again, we are trying to work that efficiency puzzle. And again, maybe that's the idea. Maybe someone who just kind of uses their base actions and just constantly spends their money and makes some progress. Maybe they make the game wrap up a little quicker. Maybe they're going to win, although they may not have as much money throughout the game. They're going to struggle in other ways. I'm just not sure. The other thing that was kind of annoying was that I don't understand why you had money and points throughout the game. I kind of felt like this was a perfect idea where money should just be your end game, your end game score. Who can make the most money, make this puzzle work efficiently for them, get things done, get contracts done, get more money, so on and so forth, and just let that money be the end game win condition. And I've seen this out of games like Distilled, tried to do this where you're trying to balance money and points, but in a business, there's no such thing as victory points. It's just money. The most successful business has the most money. And so I feel like games that try to split the gap between money and victory points always kind of leave you just feeling weird. Because again, you could sell something for $4 or complete a contract for $1 and 3 points or something like that. And it was like, how do I understand what a point is worth when I want to be trying to get money, right? Anyways, that was my impression of Salton Sea by DeVere. After all that heavy gaming on Friday, I'll admit I was a little bit shellacked, and I almost considered just kind of going back to the pool, getting a couple of drinks, and just hanging out for the night. And I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't, because I ended up back into the game hall, and I was kind of wandering around, and I ran into Wendy Yee and Emery Harris, a new employee there at the Dice Tower, and we ended up kind of grabbing just a couple of random attendees and sitting down at a table to play So Clover. Now, So Clover is a party game where you are putting these sort of paper cardboard tiles onto this plastic 4-leaf clover, and each of these tiles has 4 words on it, and when you're done, each leaf of this 4-leaf clover will have 2 words facing it, and you have to write with a dry erase marker a single word clue that sort of ties those 2 words together or makes you think of those 2 words. And then you add a 5th tile or card to the 4 that you already have on this clover. You kind of randomize them and you put it out in the middle of the table for all the other players to sort of kibitz on how these were arranged in your original layout. And it's a cooperative game, if I didn't say that already, and there is a real simple scoring mechanism in which, if they get it right on the first try, you get 3 points, and if you have to, change it, or if you have to basically tell them what's wrong, then each time you do that, you subtract the point until it's eventually worth no points, and then you just sort of finish. And you go around the table. Everybody gets 1 try at it, and then you add up your total score. I think you divide it by the number of players. Anyways, we didn't bother with the score. We just played with these components. We did some puzzles, and we had some fun. One of the players just could not wrap his head around the concept. So he played, but he didn't put out a clover of his own. And it got his wife actually chatting with Wendy about these word puzzle games. And Wendy brought up Just One, which is another word-based clue-giving game with dry erase boards and whatever else. And as she described it, the lady goes, "Well, that sounds really neat." And Wendy goes, "Well, hey, we can just play it right here." And so we used the So Clover pieces, these plastic pieces, the dry erase markers. She brought up just a random word generator on her phone, and we one at a time gave the group a word to try and give clues for. So if you haven't played Just One, the guesser has to sort of reveal a word that they don't know. Everybody around the table has to then come up with another clue that corresponds to that word. And then they all reveal their clues to each other, and any duplicates are removed so that there is just one, possibly, clue left remaining. But of course, if no one matches, then they'll have the full potential suite of clues to work with. This game always makes me a bit nervous, especially when I'm the one trying to guess, because everyone sort of thinks in their own way. They think they've got something clever. The game sort of encourages out of the box thinking, because if everyone just goes with the obvious clue, well, then they're all going to get eliminated. So anyways, it was really funny that we all played Just One with the components of So Clover and a cell phone, and you really don't need the box of Just One to play Just One. I mean, certainly not an encouragement to not go buy the game. It's a decent game. I enjoy it in general as a party game. But it was neat to get to play these 2 games with some just random folks and have some good laughs. These are definitely games that get people talking and laughing and just having a good time. And so I'm glad I stayed to check out So Clover and kinda Just One. By now, we're into Saturday, and Saturday was a bit busy for me because I had to start off the day with back-to-back tournaments of PitchCar, and I was helping Tom Vassell out with this. He has a huge collection of PitchCar components, and he loves to do this at Dice Tower East. He used to do this at the Dice Tower Retreat. He's even suggested that he might do it again this year, and I'm quite excited. But he has, like I said, a ton of these pieces. He lays out these large, sort of convoluted tracks. He even has some 3D printed pieces that they have made to just further complicate this game. But it's a racing game where you use these wooden tokens, these little wooden discs, almost like a crokinole disc, as a car. They have a little sticker on it of the top of an F1 car. And you just simply flick these things down the track, and the first person to get to the end of the track wins the game, except for that Tom has loop-de-loops and crazy jumps and this piece with all these little pegs in it, and it's just absolute insanity. He did the first tournament with some kids, and that was a lot of fun. One kid, Dylan, just had this incredible flick, shot off a ramp, went way off the track, rolled across the table, went right back up onto the track, and stopped right dead in the middle. And Tom let it stick for that game, but in the adults game, which came right afterwards, he said, look, you can only skip like 2 pieces of track, and then you'll have to reset and start over again, even if you wind up back on the track. So I, of course, played with the adult league. I was doing pretty good. I got to the jump. I think I was 2nd or 3rd place. and then just biffed it for the next, 4 or 5 shots. I did eventually land the jump. I got a little ways into the next, I think the next corner, and then the game basically ended. But that was a lot of fun. PitchCar is just a great game, and I would love to start collecting. I've got some of the mini components. I'd love to start collecting some of the standard size components, but this game is quite expensive at this point. It comes back out into production every once in a while. You got to kind of be ready for it, and I'm never ready for things. But a great game, PitchCar. After that, I went back into the expo hall, and there was someone I had been chatting with who had a demo of a game there called Solarion, and I think it's Foundations of Empires or something like that. And this is a 4X space game with deck building as a core sort of mechanic. And when I was sitting there the night before playing Salton Sea with some folks, I saw, who I later learned was actually the designer of the game, demoing the game to some other folks in the general play area. The expo hall had closed, and so he kind of scooped up the game and he would go and demo it to other players. And I thought, man, I'd really love to check out this game. Well, obviously it was the middle of the day, so he couldn't do that then, but he just grabbed a couple cards and we just kind of sat there and played through a couple of turns. And it was really neat. And I was talking to him about the channel, I was talking to him about my videos. I then went off to play another game, which I'll get to in just a moment, and I started getting texts from a couple of people who were saying, hey, this guy's looking for you. They want to get you a game. And they did. And here it is, Solarion. This is the demo. I was right, Foundation of Empires. Yeah, yay me. This is the copy that he was demoing there at Dice Tower East. They provided this copy to me, let me take it home so I could start producing some content for it here on the channel. I love space games. I generally like 4X games. I'm not super huge on combat, so I'm curious to see how that's going to work in this. But I absolutely love deck building games. This has a lot of stuff in it. It plays, I believe, up to 4 players, but there are going to be different factions you can play. I think up to 6 or more different factions that you can play as throughout the game. There's also a sort of a solo bot mode that you can either use to add to another player into the game, or of course just play a head-to-head against a solo bot. So I'm really looking forward to checking out Solarion, Foundations of Empires. After demoing Solarion, I went to the Dice Tower East Hot Games room. This is a separate ballroom, a smaller room, kind of more of a conference room, if you will, where they have just a number of the kind of most popular games going on at that moment. So they had 4 Shuffle there, which I did play, but not in that room. They had Foundations of Metropolis, I think it's called, this sort of retail version of Foundations of Rome. It looks to be exactly the same as Foundations of Rome, just obviously a much cheaper copy. I didn't bother playing it because I've already played Foundations of Rome several times. There's some new Splendor Pokemon game that apparently is just blowing up the hobby right now. I've never been a huge fan of Splendor, and I have no interest in Pokemon, so I didn't check that out, don't really plan on it. But anyways, they had another table there playing Skyrise, and there's a gentleman sitting there reading the rules. I sat down and joined him. We eventually got 2 more players, and we played Skyrise. This was another Kickstarter game, and it's one of those, like Foundations of Rome, a huge lavish production. I think there were 3 different tiers of this game that you could buy that kind of step up and up the production values of the game. And this was, I think, one of the higher versions of it, right? It has a board, but then it has these large plastic pieces that are supposed to represent a floating, flying city, right? And there's 4 large districts in each corner, and then a little central island in the middle that sits just slightly higher. There are bridges that connect certain pieces of these cities, of these areas, these districts into each other. And the idea is that it's a bidding game. Each player has a player color. They have a number of buildings with numbers on the bottom that represent a bid value, kind of like the game of Raw. You have set prices that you get to work with. There's no actual currency in the game. And each of these districts is broken up into different spaces, and they're not like a simple grid. It's not just squares or hexes. They're oddly shaped neighborhoods or sectors that you're working within. And then you get some goals at the beginning of the game. Maybe I think I was trying to build on green spaces. And there are a couple other things out and about that maybe you're trying to get. There's these little just cardboard tokens on each of the different spaces, and they're randomly placed, so they may not correspond to the color of the space that they're sitting on, but they'll give you some end game scoring. And what you're trying to do is basically a player, when it's their turn to go, they'll put a building out and they'll set the starting bid. and then you place out one of your buildings, if you're next, whoever is next, you place out one of your buildings in a adjacent sector, sharing any edge with the sector that the first player placed in, and of course you have to play a higher number. When the last person either passes, you can also work yourself into a section where basically there's no adjacent sectors. You kind of work yourself into a dead end. Then the bidding ends, and whoever has the highest price building out there essentially just flips the building over. It stays in that area, and everyone else takes their buildings back. And you just repeat this over and over and over and over again. There's a Era 1 building set of buildings, an Era 2 set of buildings. When Era 1 ends, that person, the person who put out their last building of the first era, they'll grab some extra points or something. And then you go into Era 2. Folks who had Era 1 buildings left over, they still get to use them. Whoever finishes Era 2 first, they also get some extra points. And when that era ends, the game is over. This game right now is very popular. It's getting a lot of buzz. I thought it was okay. First of all, I'm just not really keen on bidding games where you have these set values. I like to be able to bid $1 higher. Maybe a much higher bid, maybe because I want to try and shut things down. Maybe I know I can bid something higher than what anyone else has. And in this game, you may not be able to do that. Your highest number may not be the highest number of buildings available. And so you cannot lock down the bid. And I just didn't really care for that. Now, there is a building in the second era called a wonder. Each player has one wonder. And when they place that wonder, they are automatically winning the bid. And that's nice, but that's the only time you can do that in the whole game. I think this is another one of those games where, again, they kind of thought, we have kind of a neat idea. Let's just make it popular by making it super, super overproduced. Let's follow the foundations of Rome formula and make a game that costs several $100s because people will then think that it's a great, amazing game. It's okay. It's not my kind of game, but it's still produced well beyond the value of the game that actually comes in the box. So I'm glad I got to check this out. Definitely not a game that I'll be adding to the collection. Skyrise. After Skyrise, I joined up with my friends Missy and her family, and we played Archeos Society. I had no idea Archeos Society existed. This is a sequel from the same company that published Ethnos, and it's a sequel to Ethnos. Now, Ethnos is an area control game where players are simply drawing cards, maybe drafting cards from a central sort of a pile, if you will, and then you're playing sets of cards. You can either play cards on the same suit or of the same value, and in Ethnos, the suits are kind of these mythological or fantasy creatures. In Archeos Society, they're kind of more sort of common tropes of explorers. So you may have a pilot, you may have, I don't know, a map maker. I can't remember them off the top of my head. And so again, you're playing all the same color, or you're playing all of the same sort of career, if you will. And then instead of trying to do area control, you're simply moving up these tracks. And there's 6 different tracks. I think there's 6 different tracks. And each space of each track will tell you how many cards of that color you have to play to climb up that track. So if you play 3 red cards, you can move up, possibly up the next space on the red track. Or you can play all the same career type. As long as the top card is red, you're then setting the color for that hand of cards. And you keep all the hands of cards that you play organized out in front of you. You'll move up those tracks at the end of each sort of round. And I think there's 3 rounds in the game. You'll score for your place on all those tracks, and then you'll score for each set of cards that you played in front of you. Each one's called an expedition, by the way, in Archeos Society. And I forgot about that in the first round. And so I was just playing 1 card expeditions to try and jump up these tracks. But then a lot of the cards I had played in front of me were worth literally nothing. You have to have at least 2 cards to score a single point. If you play 5 cards, you get 8 points. And so a lot of people were playing larger hands of cards, with more cards than they needed to play, but to grab that extra end round scoring. And so that set me back. At the end of the first round, I was a good 12 points behind everybody else. At the end of the game, I think I was only 6 points behind first place. And if I had played a little smarter at the beginning of the round, I would have done better in the game. I'm still just not crazy about this. It's just a simple sort of a ladder climbing, card shedding kind of a game. It's fine. I am glad I got to check it out. I probably do like it a little more than Ethnos because everyone can just move up the tracks independently. You don't have this weird area control element that Ethnos has. A fine game. Glad I got to check out Archeos Society. After Archeos Society, I went to see Grant Lyons perform a stand-up comedy routine. I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy, first of all, and I know of Grant Lyons. He used to be a Dice Tower contributor on Board Game Breakfast. I had met him a few times just kind of in passing. I get the impression he knows who I am just through, my presence on the Dice Tower, but I've never really stood around and chatted with him very often, and I've certainly never seen him perform. So I was really excited to go and do that. He had a fantastic set. He did almost 90 minutes, a lot of board game related jokes, which was fantastic. I mean, he was able to connect with the audience, a board gaming audience, in ways that, most stand-up comics would not be able to do. So I'm really glad I got to check that out. Now, he was suggesting to Tom Vassell at the beginning, or just before the show started, that he was going to try something that he had done before, and it had worked out pretty well. And when he mentioned it, I thought, I might duck out of this. He proposed doing a room-sized game of Blob Party. Now, I've never heard of Blob Party, but the idea of Blob Party is that you get a set of clues. You usually have a large group of players, and then players come up with their own answers. And as players start to come up with similar answers, they group into blobs. And the idea is eventually at the end of the game to have everybody in one large blob. Now, you'd usually play this with, 10, 12, 15 players. He did it with 400. And his first two clues were ancient nature. And so I kind of sat there and I thought about it. I said, well, Grand Canyon, right? That's ancient. That's part of nature. And so then he started going around just asking people to kind of give out some answers. Well, someone said dinosaurs, and 100 people went and joined that blob, which was just eye-popping. Finally, someone towards the back of the room shouted Grand Canyon. And I thought, oh, thank goodness I'm not in this on my own. I joined that group. Tom Vassell was in that group as well, which was really funny. And then I think the next clue we came up with baseball. We grabbed a couple people with baseball. Then there was another clue that we just whiffed. No one joined us on that one. And then there was finally one that actually had to do with a joke. It was like high school or school food or something like that, or school beverage. I don't remember. And he had done a joke earlier in the show about milk, and everybody said milk, and we were into one blob. And we did it in 6 of the 7 rounds that he proposed. And it was fun to play it, but the most fun part of it was that he was kind of moving from group to group as each group, as the number of groups got smaller, and he was asking their answers, and then he was just kind of riffing, trying to kind of come up with jokes. Not mean, he wasn't being mean, but just some jokes on, okay, well, that's certainly an answer. Did anyone else have this? No, okay, well, keep trying. And it was so funny to be a part of that. I'm really glad I got to check that out. That was Blob Party at the Grant Lyons Comedy Show. That was the end of Saturday. Now, Sunday was the end of Dice Tower East, and so I knew I had a lot of work to do that day. I basically got the game hole, and I got to play one game before I had to break apart and start setting or tearing down. And that game was Fast Sloths. This is from Freedom and Freeze. It is an older game. I don't remember what year it is. I'm going to say maybe 2017, something back in there, maybe a little older than that. But this is a game where you have this large, colorful board showing different types of hexagonal grids or hexagonal spaces, and you've got plains and forests, you've got some mountains. It's very much like Caldera Park. And then you have these little sloth tokens that sit around. You have these wooden discs that represent different animals. And you're trying to move all the way around this board and collect up all of your leaves so you can eat them as a sloth. But you can't move. You can't just choose to move your sloth. You have to ride or be somehow moved by other animals. So the elephant, you could ride the elephant and then it would throw you on its trunk a couple of spaces. You could form the ants into an ant train or chain, and then they would kind of pass you along from one end to the other. The donkey would just carry you around. The eagle would come in and pick you up and carry you a number of spaces. And it was actually quite a lot of fun. I'd heard about this just a little earlier in the con. Someone was mentioning it, and I thought, I'd really like to check this out. As we were playing it, I thought, I bet you my wife and daughter would really like this. I wonder if I can get a copy of it. Nope, it's like $90 online, out of print. Don't know if it'll ever come back into print, but I did have a good amount of fun playing Fast Sloths. That was the end of the convention, but it wasn't the end of my gaming. So at the end of the convention, several hours later, after I had helped break down tons of game shelves and breaking down all the dexterity games and even took a trip to a storage unit to help them unload a bunch of stuff, I found myself back at the Carib Royal Resort there in Orlando. It was getting a little later into the evening. We had gone out for a nice dinner with the Dice Tower crew, and I hung out there in the hotel lobby until Emery, who I've already mentioned, and Chris Yee, and Jason Levine, and one other gentleman by the name of Renee joined us in the lobby, and we just started playing through a bunch of really little card games. The first one that Chris Yee brought out is called Spring Rally. This is sort of I'm going to say a kids level trick-taking game where you're trying to race cars that kind of look like little wind-up cars around this track. The track is incredibly simple. It's just a number of spaces, like Candyland or Sorry, whatever, just a set number of spaces around this track. You're playing tricks of cards. There are 3 colors, red, blue, and green. And the idea is that obviously the opening suit, is what you're trying to best. But if someone doesn't have that color, then they can enter a second color. That second color becomes the trump color, and the highest number in that color would win, unless another player doesn't have that color and they enter the third color, which then it becomes the trump color, and the highest number of that color wins the trick, which seems fairly simplistic, but it's also incredibly random. Now, if you don't win a trick, you have a little piece of cardboard in front of you, a couple little pieces, and a little crank, and you get to crank a little dial up this outer ring, sort of a track, and they go from like 1 to 3 to 5, I don't know, 7, 10, 15, 16, something like that, and then the numbers start to go down again. Because, you have a wind-up toy. You wind them too far, they kind of bog down, they don't really go at all, right? And the idea is that at the end of the round, you get to move as far as you've cranked this thing. So even though you're not winning tricks, you still get to move. If you do win a trick, you can move that number of spaces and unwind your crank at the same time, potentially shooting very far around the track. And simply the first player to finish 2 laps of this track wins the game. I think for a kid's game, this game would be fine. It's a good introduction into trick taking. I kind of felt from my perspective that it was just very unpredictable. The fact that you could play, if someone plays a 5 of blue and you think, oh, perfect, I've got the 13. It's the highest number in the color. And the next person plays a red and you're just out. There's no concept of, one particular suit that's better than the other. It's simply the next color or the third color that automatically wins. And it's that unpredictability that was kind of frustrating for me, at least personally. Everyone did seem to really like it. I was like, okay, fine, hey, whatever. I didn't win it, but I did okay at Spring Rally. The next game that we played was Sushi Go. This is a fairly common game, sort of a set collection drafting game. You're passing these cards around. You're trying to put out pieces of nigiri, pieces of nori seaweed, all kinds of stuff. And you're just collecting these different cards and trying to get the most points. I think Jason Levine won this one. There was a dessert card that if you get the most of it by the end of the game, you can pick up a ton of points, and I didn't have any of them. So that was Sushi Go. After that, we played Scout. Scout is a fairly popular card game, and I was surprised. I have played it. I didn't really care for it. I didn't really get it. But then Chris Yee made the comment that he too was not really keen on the game, and I found that surprising because he kind of likes a bit of everything, even some really obscure, weird stuff. And so we started playing Scout, and even I don't think he really changed his mind. I certainly didn't change my mind. This is kind of a ladder climbing game, so someone may play a 5, and all you got to do to beat the 5 is play any number that's higher than a 5. But you can also play a run. So 2 cards, say a 2 and a 3, would beat the 5. You could also play a pair, which would beat a run of the same number of cards. So a pair of 2s would beat a 2 or 3, or even a 4 and 5. And that's all you're doing. So the more cards you can get played out will beat the previous hand, and you would take the previous hand of cards, which simply become points per card to you. If you cannot beat the current hand, however, then you have to scout, and that means taking a card off of one end of the cards that were played. So if there was a 5, 6, 7, 8, you'd have to take the 5 or the 8, and you take it in your hand, and the player who had that hand out there, they would get a point. The reason you take the ends, I really don't know what the reason is, but the cards are actually two-ended, not two-sided, two-ended. So that 4, 5, 6, 8 may have a different run of numbers on the other side that are completely different. And you can see what each number is on each end of each card. So you may see that, well, that 5 on the one end has an 8 on the other, and maybe you're sitting on a 7 and 9, and you can slot that card in between. I should mention that, by the way, you cannot typically reorganize the cards in your hand. So only when you're scouting can you put a card in between other cards, from the way that they were dealt to you. And I think that's just it, that limiting factor of it really does come down to the hand that you're dealt. Emery played a run right towards the end of the game. Actually, I think he ended the game. And it was a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It was this huge run of cards, and he literally said, I was dealt this at the beginning of the round. That's great. Good for you. I had 2 pairs. That was it. And so I had no chance at winning this game. And so even though there is a little bit of agency there, there's a little bit of stuff you can do to kind of try and set you up with some better moves, it may just come down to the luck of the deal. And so that's why Scout was never a big game for me. The next game we played was called Roll for It Deluxe Edition. This isn't really a game. It's kind of more of an activity. You have 3 cards out in front of everybody. Each card shows a number of dice of different values. You have 6 dice on your turn. You roll all the dice you currently have, and then you can assign dice to any of the cards in that current display. You can also pull your dice back from other cards at the beginning of your turn to roll them, but you cannot move a die from one card to the next. And once you have enough dice of matching values on a card, you claim that card. Each card's worth a varying number of points. That's it. It's one of those games. It's a nice activity game. It's something if you're kind of waiting for something, maybe if you're hanging out in the pub, just talking to friends, you can kind of play this inside. It takes almost no thought whatsoever, but it's also just completely random. You have no idea what you're going to get. There were a few times I thought, gosh, it'd be really great if I could roll 4 6s right here and claim that card. Oh, that'd be great. And you don't, because of course you don't. And the moment you start to feel like you're trying to win, you'll just be disappointed. And that's Roll for It. Barely worth being called a game, but it's fine. The last one that we played, and it was a little bit of a bummer to end this whole event on a bad note, but we played Pumafioso. Never heard of this thing. Chrissy brought this one out. It's another trick-taking game with this kind of Puma gangster kind of a theme. There's a number of cards in the middle of the table, I think ranging from -3 to 10, but it's not every number in between. Players get a hand of cards. They get 10 cards, I think it's 10, at the beginning of each round, and then you pull 3 into your actual hand. So you have a deck of 7 and a hand of 3. There's no suits. There's just numbers 1 to 55. You play a card. The second highest card of the trick wins, and then they take that card and they stick it next to one of those central cards, basically sort of gambling that card's going to stay in that slot, that no one's going to push that card down by sort of bidding that same number of that central column. If they do, if something bumps them down that stack, then they're going to lose a point, and they're going to lose it for every spot that they ratchet down. Whoever manages to kind of win the last trick of the round will probably put it at the 10 spot at the top if their card is higher or if that spot is still open, and they're going to score that 10 points at the end of the round. So you can score positive or negative values as a result of each round. You play for 3 rounds. I hated this game. I thought that the idea of being second to win meant that it was so unpredictable, especially with a hand of only 3 cards to work with. Someone may have a 45, you throw out the 44. Oh, I actually had the second place card. Well, then someone drops out the 50, forcing the other player who had the 45 to win. But that might have been the only thing that they could have played that made any sense. They maybe took some sort of a calculation that, well, hey, that card's not going to bump me down. I don't know. It just felt so random. The only time that I felt like I had any agency at all was when I was the last player for the trick. And I was shocked to learn that this was a Reiner Knizia game. And I sat there afterwards and I thought, what in the world made him think that second highest card is the way to do this? And I really felt like someone was sitting there saying, well, this game is just so simple. It's easy. There's no, whatever. Oh, I know. Let's make it weird. Let's make it second highest card. That'll really screw this thing up. And it did. And that was Pumafioso. And that was Dice Tower East. I did have a great time going overall. Yeah, the last couple of games were kind of a bummer. I'm glad I got to check out some fairly new stuff. I'm also really looking forward to going to the Dice Tower Retreat here in a couple weeks. I already have a couple of games now on my list of stuff that I know I can get played a little easier than I was able to get stuff played at Dice Tower East. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this list of games that I got to check out and play, the experiences I got to have at Dice Tower East. I will see you again very soon. Cheers.